Well, good morning. Hey, I just want to take a second to address the boot in the room. I've had an absolutely amazing ski season, all the way up till the last run. So good news, no broken bones, no torn muscles, believe no torn ligaments. Just get a really cool boot to wear for a while. I told the doctor it's been a legit 30 years since I've had pump-up high tops, and so I'm trying to make the most of this experience. Remember, like back in the day, it's really dating myself, but Shaq had some shoes where you could pump it up, so I get to pump up my boot. But I'm doing good, and I'm excited to be able to be here with us this morning as we continue in our series, Asking for a Friend. And if you're here for the first time, really in this series, what we're trying to do is we're trying to address or answer some difficult questions that people have when it comes to Christianity or God or even the Bible. Matter of fact, last week we started the whole thing off by answering the question about the Bible's trustworthiness. Like, can the Bible be seen as something that's trustworthy? And we really felt like it was important to start with that question because throughout this series, we're going to be coming back to the Bible to answer some of the other questions. And so if you weren't with us last weekend, I'd encourage you to check out that message. You can find it on our website at lakesawyerchurch.org, or you can check it out on our YouTube channel as well. As we continue in the series, though, today we're going to be dealing with the question of suffering. And suffering is sort of a universal human experience. Each and every one of us in our life, we have gone through seasons of suffering. And of course, it's looked different for us as we live different lives. But for you, maybe some of that suffering was the moment you found out your parents were getting divorced, or that suffering's come from a prolonged or lifelong illness that you've had to deal with. Perhaps the suffering is because you've lost someone near and dear to you from cancer. Maybe that suffering happened the moment your spouse walked out on you. Maybe the suffering is the byproduct of you being abused, and all of it is these painful moments and realities that we hold with us. And so we wrestle with, what does this all mean? What does suffering mean? And it's not just suffering that we experience and that we see on a personal level. Like, we can zoom out and we can see suffering taking place on a global scale. And so we see children dying of starvation. As Jennifer talked about at the beginning, we see that there's children who are dying because they lack access to clean drinking water. There's nations at war with each other. There is genocide that is happening, and we see all this and we wonder why. Like, why does this happen? Why is there suffering? Or maybe more directly, the question we ask is, well, why does God allow suffering? Like, why does God allow this to happen? And the whole conversation about suffering, it can overwhelm us, but it's the why does God part that can make us a bit uneasy, especially as Christians. Because when people ask us, like, well, why does God allow suffering? Like, we almost don't know what to say. We're a little overwhelmed. We're shy. We don't know how to address the topic. But what I want us to understand, really from the very beginning, is the Bible is not shy when it comes to addressing people's anguish, confusion, their pain, and their suffering. As a matter of fact, in the scriptures, we see that there are books and major themes of these books that deal with issues of pain, anguish, and suffering. So you see books like the book of Job, or the book of Psalms, or Ecclesiastes, or Lamentations. We see this sort of play out in the reality of people's lives. Again, affirming that this is a universal human experience. Now, it's important for us to also understand that the Bible reflects the reality of the world into which it was written to. And so in the ancient world, again, the world that was happening around the times that the Bible was written, 1 in 5 children would die by the age of 1. 50% of all children would die by the time they reach 10 years old. I mean, people in the ancient world are dealing with suffering on a level that is just beyond what most of us can even fathom. And today, people look at suffering, even though we could argue it's not as significant as suffering was in the ancient world. We look at suffering today and we have a different perspective than people did in the ancient world. And see, today when we experience or we see suffering, we begin to wonder. We begin to say, well, okay, isn't suffering proof? Isn't suffering evidence that God doesn't actually exist. Or people will say, well, if God was real, and you've probably heard this before, maybe you've even thought this, if God was real, then God wouldn't allow the people he loves to suffer. And while that might seem like a logical conclusion to reach on the surface, we can recognize, if we step back from it, that we can understand that suffering and pain or suffering and love, they're not always opposed to each other. Like in many ways, they're a package deal. And while it might be hard for us to reckon that when it comes to God, for those of us who are parents, we can understand that suffering and love, or suffering and pain and love, they're often package deals. They can go together because we've raised our kids. And so if you have young kids at home, you probably have an experience like I'm about to describe, or if your kids have raised and grown, moved out of the house, you could probably reflect on an experience like this. But when my kids, when they were young, they would often go to the playground, like kids do, and they would do some crazy things on the playground. And often I would see what was happening. I'm thinking, okay, she's going to fall. She's going to fall and she's going to hurt herself. And so I have a moment as a parent. Do I swoop in there and rescue her, preventing her from falling, or do I just sort of allow it to happen? And often, as you know, as parents, we allow it to happen. Or it's not even physical stuff. It could be emotional, relational stuff. Like they're treating a friend a certain way. And as a parent, you're like, this is not going to end well for you. But we allow them to experience it because we know that there can be growth that comes from pain and suffering. And so if we go back again, my kid, they're on the playground or on their bike. They're riding their bike. They fall over. The moment they fall over, they don't look up and go, does my father exist? Is dad real? They also don't fall over and go, I don't think dad loves me. Again, so we can look at it logically in our lives and see, okay, these go together. Pain and suffering and love, they go together. But when it comes to God, we're like, they don't belong. It's evidence to the fact that God doesn't exist. And the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes, and I don't say this lightly, but sometimes suffering has a point. And just because we can't see a good reason for why God might allow something like this to happen, it doesn't mean that there isn't a reason. Like many of you, I have gone through seasons of suffering in my life. And there are times in the midst of the suffering, I can't make sense of it. I don't understand why it's happening. But if I can get to the other side of suffering, I can see in hindsight what God has done through some of those seasons. In 2006, I got one of the most difficult phone calls I've ever received in my life. My grandma called me and she said, hey, I just want to let you know your grandpa's not doing well and he's being rushed to the hospital. And, that's a phone call that no one ever wants to receive. But my grandpa, he wasn't just a grandpa, he was my best friend. He was my hero. I was like this weird kid in high school that would go spend weekends hanging out with my grandpa because I just loved to be with my grandpa. And so when my grandma calls me with this news that grandpa's gone to the hospital, like I don't even remember what I was doing in that moment, but it all stopped. And I remember I ran right to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, got up to where he was at in the emergency room, pretty much moments after I arrived, he quickly started to go into cardiac arrest. And if you've ever been in a season or a moment like that, you know that things go quickly. And so I'm there, my grandma's there, my grandpa has 4 boys, kind of scattered across the United States. And so quickly, like I'm picking up the phone and like updating everybody, this is what's happening. You know, they're trying to quickly make arrangements to figure out how they can get down there as quick as possible. And I get off the phone with them and I come back and I'm with my grandma, and the doctors are still doing chest compressions on my grandpa. And at this point, it's gone on for a fair amount of time. And the doctors look to us and they say, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to continue? There's probably significant damage. There's probably broken ribs. Do you want us to continue, or do you want us to cease doing CPR? And my grandma, she looked at me, and it was a second marriage for her and for my grandpa. And she looked at me and she said, I'm not blood family. I can't make this decision. You have to make the decision. And she walked out. And guys, I was 25 years old, like completely out of my depth with my hero. And I have to make this choice. And I remember I consulted with the doctors. I tried to get all the information I could. But at the end of the day, I chose to stop CPR. And I remember the days that transpired after that, even months that went by. I was so angry. I was angry at my grandma. I was angry at my uncles. I was angry at my dad. Like, why did I, some 25-year-old kid, have to make that decision? But over time, God reframed that whole day for me. Not in that, like, man, I'm so grateful I got to make that decision. No, I would give up that decision 1,000 times over. But the further away I got from it, the more I realized how special that moment was. Because as my grandpa breathed his last breath, I got to hold his hand. I got to pray over him. I got to say goodbye like no one else in the family got to say goodbye. Again, would never want to do that again. But I'm so appreciative of the fact that God gave me those moments. Those are moments, as hard as they are, that I will cherish and remember for the rest of my life. I see that God was with me in the midst of suffering. And I think that's a perspective that we so often forget. Like, God is with us, even in the most difficult moments and seasons of our life. And I know as I say that, someone might think, well, Mike, the question isn't, is God with us in suffering? The question is, why does God allow suffering? Why does he allow it? And for us to begin to answer that question, we actually have to start and understand where suffering came from to begin with. Because what you see from the opening pages of the Bible is that suffering was never a part of God's original plan. Like, that's not what God intended. When God spun the world into order, when he created everything, he wasn't like, yes, let's make suffering a part of the human experience. Matter of fact, when we look at the opening pages of the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 1, we see at each point when God creates, he pauses and he acknowledges that what he has created is good. After he finishes his creating work, we read this in Genesis 1, verse 31. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. I mean, God, like, he makes everything. He's like, this is not just good, this is very good. Now, when we read that, it's not good as like you and I might arbitrarily define what good is. When he says it is good, what he's meaning is everything is as he intended it to be. Creation is perfect, just like he wanted it. And suffering wasn't a part of creation. It wasn't a part of God's original plan. Now, suffering came into fold at the moment of the fall. And so if you're familiar with some of the Bible, if not, I'm going to give you a quick lesson here. Adam and Eve, they chose their way over God's way. Their choice enters in pain and suffering into our world. God gave them the ability to choose right and wrong, to choose good and bad. Choice is what makes suffering possible. It's what makes evil possible. So God creates. It is good, just as he intended. He creates Adam and Eve, but with them, he gives them a choice, and it's their choice to choose, again, their way over God's way that brings pain and suffering into our world. Which I get can beg the question, well, then why does God give them a choice? Like, if it was all good, he probably foreknew that to give people a choice would lead to some of these things happening. Well, then why does God give people a choice? And it's because without choice, there cannot be love. That God has created this world for love. He created this world so that he could love us. He's created this world so that we could love him. And the only way for love to exist is if people have the freedom to choose it. We all know that to be true. Like, you cannot force someone to love you. It's not going to work out well if you've ever tried. Like, you can't force people to love you. God couldn't force people to love him without a choice, without the ability to choose something else. And so we think, okay, all right, but we want our cake and we want to eat it too. So we're like, okay, God, we want choice, we want free will, but like, if you could just take away the pain and suffering part, like, we'll make our choices, good choices, bad choices. Well, we can live with the sort of the ramifications of those choices as long as it doesn't include pain and suffering. But it doesn't work like that as much as we want it to. Because for God to remove pain and to remove evil and to remove suffering from our world today, it would require God to remove us. You see, who among us hasn't gone through life without thinking an evil thought, without doing an evil action, without evil words, without causing another person harm? If we wanted all of that bad to be out of the world, again, it would necessitate God removing us from the world. And as weird as this might sound, suffering exists in our world today because of love. Because God will do whatever he can to be in relationship with us. That he knows that as humans we're flawed, we'll make mistakes, we'll make bad choices that will lead us into some difficult and painful seasons, but he can't remove it completely without removing us. You see, suffering isn't proof or evidence that God doesn't exist. I might go so far as saying that it's actually evidence that he does exist. That suffering doesn't disprove God's existence, if you will. It actually supports it. And again, like, bear with me here, because at first you might be like, what do you mean? Well, how does suffering support God's existence? Well, first off, suffering is based on a preconceived idea or notion of right and wrong, good and evil. Like, we have these ideas. Well, that's right, that's wrong, that's good, that's evil, this is okay, well, this is bad. All of that is on the basis of what? You see, without God, there is no moral point of reference. Like, who has the wisdom or the right to determine what is right and wrong? If not God, then who? You? Do you or do I, do we get to determine what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is acceptable? Like, how do we go about making those decisions? Now, some of you are probably aware of a brilliant writer and thinker named C.S. Lewis. If you don't know who C.S. Lewis is, he wrote the books The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you've probably seen the movies. But he's done a lot of thinking and documenting his own journey of seeking out to disprove Christianity, only to find its sort of validity and to place his trust and hope and life in Jesus. And this is some of the stuff that Lewis said. Lewis thought that suffering in our world today was foolproof evidence that God could not possibly exist. But the more he thought about it and the more he wrestled with it, the more he came to the conclusion that suffering is a bigger problem for atheists than it actually is for Christians. This is what Lewis would say. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, he says, of course I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Consequently, in conclusion, he says atheism turns out to be too simple. What he's saying is, look, when people object to God on the basis of suffering, it comes from some sense of fair play and justice. This idea that people shouldn't suffer, that people shouldn't be oppressed. But if there is no God, and this world is just this evolutionary mechanism of natural selection where the strongest and fittest survive, then what problem do we have with suffering? What issue do we have with oppression? There's no issue, there's no moral compass. It's just how the world works. If there's not a God to weigh behaviors and actions against, it's just the natural part of the world. Is that what we're left to conclude? Now, some people say, no. Really, we would decide what's right and wrong on the basis of what individuals see as what is loving and right or wrong to other people. But the problem with that is we can see pretty quickly it becomes very arbitrary. Like if it's just you who gets to decide what is okay with other people, then we have to also wrestle with the reality that there is a lot of individuals doing unjust things to other people who look at what they're doing and think, this is perfectly okay behavior. Like when people do horrible things, like murder other people, there are individuals who think, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay for me to do that. And so we're like, okay, well, that doesn't work. We can't just leave this whole thing up to individuals. And so we'll say, okay, it's not individuals, but it's the collective majority. That what the collective majority determines is right and wrong then becomes the sort of the metric. It's how we weigh things. It's how we understand what is permissible and what isn't. But even with that, it's like, but what majority? For example, if you would have been raised or grown up in Germany in the 1940s, the majority of people felt it was perfectly okay to kill over 6 million Jews. What majority? If you were raised in the Roman Empire in the first century, the majority of people felt it was perfectly okay to gather up Christians and feed them to hungry lions. What majority? Who gets to choose right and wrong? See, the majority or the individual argument, it doesn't support itself. If there's not God, there is not right and wrong. We're comparing suffering to some standard, to something. We're comparing it to what God has set in order. And even if we can get there, and even if we can say, okay, I'm tracking with this, it still leaves us with the question, well then, what does God do with all of this? What's God's role in all of this? Is God just like sitting up in heaven, watching all of his people down below suffer and like getting like a thrill out of watching his people go through anguish and pain and suffering? Like what is God's purpose in this? And what I want us to understand, and what Scripture is really clear about, is that God knew. He knew what it was like to go through pain. He knew what it was like to go through seasons of suffering, because if you know the biblical narrative, you know that God just doesn't exist apart from the world, but that through his son Jesus, he sent his son into the world. Another way of saying that is that God entered into humanity and he suffered like the rest of us. That God, through his son Jesus, enters into humanity and he experiences pain. God experiences suffering just like the rest of us. That Jesus willingly left heaven and came to earth for us. I mean, Jesus says this about himself in Luke 17. He says, but first he, being Jesus, speaking of himself, must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Jesus is saying, look, suffering is a part of why I'm here. And if you know the story of the life of Jesus, that's exactly what happened. Jesus was rejected by his family. He was rejected by his closest friends. He was falsely accused. He was imprisoned. He was tortured. And then he died possibly the most painful death known to man, by being crucified on a cross. Jesus experienced pain and suffering on levels that many of us will never comprehend. And I can't imagine what it was like to be God in that moment. Like to see your son that you've sent down to earth and to see him go through this. And again, I get it. It begs questions like, why? Why would God allow his son to go through this? Why would God allow us to go through it? And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We don't fully know the answer. I can't sit up here and give you like this foolproof biblical reason to why God allows suffering. But I will tell you this. I'll affirm it again and again. It's not because he doesn't love us. That he loves us. That he sent his son into the world to experience pain and suffering for us. But if we're being honest with ourselves, even for those of us who've been Christian for maybe all our lives, we know that it's in the difficult seasons of suffering that we can need more than just assurance that God is for us and with us. Like when it's the most difficult times, when it's the pain and the anguish, when it's real, yes, it's helpful to know that God is for us and with us, but we candidly, we often need more. What we need is hope. In the midst of our suffering, we need hope. We need to know that there's something beyond this experience in this season that we find ourselves in. And the Bible's really clear that hope does lie around the corner. Matter of fact, Jesus says it himself. Jesus says these words in John 16. He says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, he says. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus says, look, in this life, you're going to have troubles. In this life, you're going to have anguish and pain and suffering. That much is certain. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. But the hope lies in what Jesus says next. Because in the second part of that verse, he says, yeah, troubles and suffering are a reality of this life, but take heart, he says, I have overcome the world. And that he did. Jesus went to the cross. He suffered on the cross. Jesus rose from the dead and he ascended into heaven to a place where the Bible tells us that God will wipe away every tear. When we get to heaven, it is a place that is good. It is a place exactly how God intended it to be. And in heaven, there will be no more pain. There will be no more suffering. The vision of heaven is a promise from God of what is to come. But between the time we get to heaven and our life right now, we live in this season of tension. We live in this reality of everything that we're experiencing now. But as Christians, if you're a Christ follower, you also walk through it with hope of what is to come. That Paul talks about it. That in the Bible, there's other people that talk about that in the midst of suffering, that we can rejoice because of the reality of hope that we have for eternity. Hope made possible by Jesus. And so no matter what it is that you're going through, don't lose sight of that perspective. That God will see you on the other side of the suffering. And maybe, if we're lucky, that happens in this life, but it's guaranteed for life eternal. But even as I say that, I want to make it really, really clear that while you find yourself in a season of suffering, if that's where you are right now, that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to wrestle and to struggle with it. I would just encourage you, though, to make sure you bring God into the questions, to make sure you're bringing God into the struggle, to make sure that God is a part of the grief. So I really think there's two kinds of people in this room. One of us, if you're a Christian, we have this tendency to be like, even in the midst of suffering, we just like, okay, God's got me. But if we're being honest, it's like this external shell that we put forth. Yeah, God's got me, but privately we're wrestling and we have turmoil. We act the part on the outside, but never surrendering it to God on the inside. And I think the other group of people look at when suffering pops up in their life, they're like, I can't believe in God. And maybe that's where you're at. Maybe you've never believed in God, but you're going through a season in your life right now that you are sure is evidence that God doesn't exist. If you're so sure that God doesn't exist and he's not real, then I might just simply ask, what harm would come to you by inviting him to step into that season with you? I actually think you'd find that there is a real and living God that you never imagined possible that makes what you're going through possible. Because without him, some of the stuff that we go through, it feels impossible. It feels overwhelming. It feels like there's no way forward. So I would encourage you, no matter which one of the people you are, I would encourage you to turn to Jesus, to tell him how you feel. Don't hold back. Be honest. Like, God can take whatever it is that we throw at him. But through it all, never, ever take your eyes off of him. That day in and day out, we choose to look to him, to pursue him as we find life and hope in him. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you so much. I thank you for Jesus. And I'm grateful for the way that he entered into humanity. The relatable way that he took on pain and suffering in his own life, but then through his life created a way for each of us to find our way back home. And so God, as we go through some of the difficult seasons, as we go through some of the struggles and the pain and the anguish of this life, I pray that we're always willing to bring Jesus into it. That through Jesus we find hope. Through Jesus we find a way forward. Through his love we find comfort. We find you. So God, no matter it is what each of us, what we brought in here today, what we're struggling with, what we're suffering through, I pray that we are bold enough to surrender it to you as we keep our eyes affixed on you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.